Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of New Books Network. This is your host, Morteza Hajizadeh from Critical Theory Channel. Today, I'm very happy to be speaking with Dr. Mary Flannery again. Dr. Mary Flannery has published a very interesting and also quite accessible book with Reaction Press. The book is called Geoffrey Chaucer, Unveiling the Merry Bard. And Dr. Mary Flannery is a fellow in English at the University of Bern. She is also the fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Society of Antiquaries. She has published widely on medieval literature and culture, and she previously wrote a book called Practising Shame, Female Honor in Later Medieval England, which was published by Manchester University Press, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a podcast about that really fascinating book available on New Books Network. And this book just came out a few months ago in 2024. Mary, welcome to New Books Network again.
Thank you so much, Morteza. It's great to be back.
Thank you. There might be a few people who, don't know you very well, or they may not have had the pleasure of listening to the previous podcast that I recorded with you. Just very briefly, it would be great if you could introduce yourself, your field of expertise, and more importantly, why you decided to write this book about Geoffrey Chaucer, given that there are lots of books about him. So I'm interested to know, how is this book different from existing ones?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a medievalist, and I actually specialize in the sort of literature and culture of later medieval England. So we're talking about sort of 14th century England right up through the early 16th century. And so in my previous work, I have focused on the work of a Chaucerian poet, John Lydgate. As you mentioned already, I've also worked on shame. And so I have found myself actually going from the themes of fame to shame, and now I'm finishing up some work on obscenity in the Middle Ages. And it was actually this current project that led me to this wonderful little biography that I've been able to complete. Because Reaction Press learned that I was leading a project that's funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation on the sort of history of Chaucer's obscenity over the last few hundred years. They approached me and sort of asked whether I might be interested in writing a sort of publication that was for the general reader and an account of Chaucer's life, but that was also kind of inflected by my current research on his bawdy humor. And so that's really what this book does. It's a short biography of his life, but you might also say that in addition to being a biography of Chaucer, it's a biography of the current idea of Chaucer, this figure who's really become associated with bawdy humor in the popular imagination. And so it looks at the events of his life, but it looks at them through the lens of that contemporary reputation to see how he became the poet as we know him today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I must say that when I was reading it, I didn't really feel that I'm reading a boring biography. It was, as you mentioned, there were lots of historical facts about him that I didn't know, but I quite enjoyed the final chapters as well. And it I guess resonated with a lot of contemporary issues or even controversies, which I'll ask you about a couple of them. But I'm interested to know why you call him the Merry Bard.
Yeah. So first thing I should say is a bit of a disclaimer. It's not my phrase. So I stole that from Joseph Addison. And he described Chaucer as a merry bard in a poem he wrote in 1694. But the interesting thing is that he kind of meant it as a bit of a backhanded compliment. He describes Chaucer as this merry bard, but one whose humor has gotten a little bit old-fashioned. So immediately after he describes Chaucer as a merry bard, he said, age has rusted what the poet writ, worn out his language and obscured his wit. In vain he jests in his unpolished strain and tries to make his readers laugh in vain. So I was really interested in this kind of early example of the reception of Chaucer's humor. As early as 1694, we're seeing someone who recognizes his skill in that department, but who's already observing that perhaps it's out of time. It doesn't really fit in the sort of end of the 17th century.
And do you think that there is a growing interest in Chaucer from the public? I live in Australia, so there are a lot of people that know about Chaucer. I don't think my colleagues do, and I'm not in academia, of course. I don't think my colleagues do, but I'm interested to know in England or Yeah, in England, maybe because he's called the father of English poetry. If he's if there's a revival of interest in his works, I have 3 copies of Canterbury Tales in my library, so
Oh,
I'm
wow.
definitely a fan.
Well, I would say then you're probably in the sort of upper echelons of Chaucer's fandom then, if you have that much of his material lying around. But I would say that really, when it comes to popular culture, at least, Chaucer is much more known, as a kind of vague figure from the past than he's known for his works specifically. So there are many more people that are likely to have heard of Chaucer and have some sort of associations with his name than there are to be people who've actually read his work, either in Middle English or even in sort of a modern English translation. But that said, his work has been being made increasingly accessible over the last, 50 to 100 years. And this is partly thanks to the increase in adaptations that we've seen. We start in the sort of middle of the 19th century with the first adaptations for children, and we get even more of those kinds of adaptations, not just for children, but also just for the general reader across the 20th century. And then, of course, we get adaptations in film, in plays. And so I think it's this that kind of keeps the sort of notion of Chaucer as a popular figure alive, even if people aren't necessarily studying his work themselves.
Mhm. And how much how much information, first-hand information, do we have about his life or interests? I previously thought that before I got interested in medieval literature and the whole culture of creating a manuscript or an illuminated manuscript. I've done a series of podcasts on that, and to me, it was very enlightening because I thought that there's this manuscript which is signed Geoffrey Chaucer, and you have it. That's why you have Canterbury Tales or other works. But then I realized no, there were scribes who were actually writing it. There were several scribes. Some of these people didn't even know how to write. Maybe they were verbal traditions. I'm not sure. Some authors. And it was to me and it also helped me to better appreciate or understand even the back and the history of my literature, because I'm originally from Iran, Iranian literature. We have a poet who has the same reputation as Chaucer. He's called the father of Persian poetry because he revived the Persian language. Lots of exaggerated stories about him as well. But I started to question those myths, let's say, or about him as well. And that came from the knowledge acquired through medieval English, medieval literature. But I'm interested to know if you have any first-hand account of his life. Your book, you have lots of fascinating stories about him that I absolutely didn't know. And I'm interested to know where we get that information.
Well, so we have a couple of different sources. I mean, for one thing, I should say you're absolutely right. There are no manuscripts of Chaucer's works that appear to survive in his hand or even from his own lifetime. It's been debated whether maybe the earliest manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, which is the Hangett manuscript at the National Library of Wales, whether that might possibly date from the end of his lifetime. But I think that theory has largely been debunked. So when it comes to his work, the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that even his work, as we know it, has been sort of filtered through lots of different scribes, editors, different versions. There are different versions of these texts. But when it comes to the actual events of his life, we have a remarkable amount of material that survives that actually documents some of the key events of his lifetime. And that's partly because from very early on in his life, he was in positions that were very close to those who were the big players in later medieval England. So the earliest record that we have concerning his life, for example, places him in the household of the Countess of Ulster, who also happens to be the wife of Prince Lionel. So this is how he starts in life. He's already kind of at the center of power or very close to that. And so, of course, we have the household accounts of this position, the later positions he went on to have, for example, in the household of the king himself, Edward III. And these already give us a very clear sense of what his station in life was at these different ages. And we have later accounts of his working life, partly because he ended up doing work that was very administrative and required a lot of documentation in London in relation to the wool custom and the petty custom there. And so, really, it's kind of incredible. I've been asked, actually, in earlier interviews and conversations with friends, when they knew I was writing about this book, well, do we actually know anything about Chaucer's life? And the answer is yes, we have an overwhelming amount of documentation. So even though he died more than 600 years ago, we can really sketch out the outlines of his life and career.
One thing I absolutely love was this manuscript where there is a CH, right? Can you talk about that? I'm sure
Yes.
our listeners would be interested. I think it's kept somewhere in the US, in the University of Pennsylvania that you mentioned, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I think, as you've already mentioned, Chaucer is often referred to as the kind of father of English poetry. And the only potentially misleading thing about that label is that, of course, he is very likely to have written poetry in French as well. At the time that he was writing, French was still very much a literary language within England. English had not really risen to that kind of level of sophistication as a literary language, even though, of course, there's a great deal of English literature that predates Chaucer. And so this is one thing that a lot of Chaucer scholars have been on a quest for, really, is to see, can we identify any surviving French poems from this period that might have been potentially written by Chaucer? And so among these sort of prime candidates are a collection of poems that are included in a compilation. This manuscript that you mentioned is at the University of Pennsylvania, MS Codex 902. And it's actually a manuscript that may have been assembled by a French-speaking acquaintance of Chaucer, Othon de Grandson, who was a Savoyard. So, in fact, I'm in Geneva right now. He is pretty much a local guy. He would have been from around this region, this part of the world. And so Grandson may very well have compiled this manuscript, which is a collection of different French songs and poems. And as you also noted, there are some of these French poems that intriguingly have the little short sort of inscription next to them of CH. And it's been suggested that potentially these were poems that were being identified as Chaucer's, whether by Grandson or by a reader, we don't know.
One aspect of Chaucer's works that I really enjoyed was that when you read his works, it gives you kind of a geographical map of England. And a lot of people has the misconception that in medieval times, if you were born somewhere, you were born there, you lived there, and you died there because it was not easy to travel. And it wasn't easy by no means. But then you have these accounts of different cities by the same author, which has a lot of resemblance to the actual geographical locations they are describing. Marjorie Kemp is a good example of this medieval lady who traveled into other countries. I'm interested to know if in Chaucer's work, he features a lot of different locations across England. Do we know, can you tell us a little bit about his travels across England and also across the continent, and how those travels helped him nurture his literary taste and creativity, which was then reflected in his works as well?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right, Morteza, to point out that there's this preconception of the Middle Ages as a very kind of immobilized age for most people. And in fact, there was a great deal of travel. I mean, there's a reason why Chaucer's most famous work, the Canterbury Tales, is a travel kind of framing narrative. It's a whole group of pilgrims who are on their way from London to Canterbury. And that's just one example of the kind of travel that ordinary people from all walks of life might participate in for one reason or another. In Chaucer's case, he traveled really throughout his life for different reasons. He traveled within England, but also, as you mentioned, on the continent. In his younger days, he would have traveled around England with the great households of which he was a member. So if these households were moving from one place to another, decamping between different dwellings, for example, or visiting other households, this is the kind of travel he would have been engaged in from an early age. And then later on, when he got into his professional life, as I was mentioning earlier, he was required to do both some traveling more locally, but also onto the continent. And this was, in fact, he was regularly required to take time off his work in London so that he could go on these various missions to France, to Italy, and elsewhere. And so this is where we see traces of that both in his descriptions of different places, for example, as you've already mentioned. They're wonderfully vivid descriptions even of the surroundings, his surroundings in the London area that are extremely detailed and really come to life. But we also see this in other features of his poetry. So, for example, even the form of his poetry changes after he goes to Italy. He comes back to England and he starts to write in a new verse form, which has come to be known as rhyme royal. And this is a stanzaic form that he derives very likely from the work of Giovanni Boccaccio, who was also a great inspiration, really, for his masterpieces, Canterbury Tales, Troilus and Cressida. So we also see it in some of the kinds of genres that he experiments in and the details that he uses in them and the subject matter. He starts to write dream poems that are become more sophisticated. They begin in a very sort of conventional, you might say even French fashion, with garden spaces being described in vivid detail, details that you would also find in earlier dream poems, like the 13th century dream poem Le Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose. And then later on, we see that he's starting to include more Dantesque details in later dream poems. So it's remarkable because we have the documentation of his travel on the one hand, and then when we look at his literary output on the other hand, we really can trace the impact of his travel on his literary work over time.
Mm. And it just goes to show that he was quite familiar with the great works of literature that were written at the time. He was an avid reader of them. And as you mentioned, he reflected them in his works. And I must say again, before we talked about how we mentioned how he's known as the father of English poetry. And when I studied literature, well, of course, I was given bits and pieces of his Canterbury Tales, but I never even bothered to check to see his other writings apart from Canterbury Tales.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as you mentioned earlier, he had written works in French as well. But can you tell us why writing in English at that time was a culturally ambitious? How did he acquire, let's say, that fame of being the father of English poetry?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, for one thing, I think we really have to bear in mind the fact that the perspective that medieval Europe would have had of medieval England is very different from the kind of perspective we might have even globally now towards England and the United Kingdom. We're living in a post-British Empire world. You're in fact, part of the, one branch of that zone. And I think that it's difficult for us to imagine that Britain and England might not have been at the heart of things, culturally speaking. But in the Middle Ages, it really was kind of at the edges of culture when we think about at least medieval Europe. So it's not a place whose literature and culture and fashion would necessarily have been exerting a great deal of influence on that of any part of the continent. Influence tended to flow the other way. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it was really rather radical to see someone who was, again, at the heart of English culture. He's in the courts, he's living among the people who are setting the standards and setting the fashions for England. And he isn't simply imitating, the kind of Frenchness, linguistically. He's not imitating the literature that already exists and that's very sophisticated. He's instead transposing a lot of its details, themes, structures, even whole narratives into English, as well as composing his own. And so, I mean, he really is the poet who raises the status of the English language as a literary language because of that. And that's something that is recognized almost immediately within a decade of his death in 1400. We see Thomas Hoccleve, who, a 15th century poet who was very much a sort of follower in Chaucer's footsteps, referring to him as a kind of father figure precisely on the grounds that Chaucer elevated English as a literary language.
We will talk about his legacy, or maybe his immediate legacy. Again, one thing I didn't know before reading the book was all the connections he had, all the context. He he mingled with some really, really important people, which might have been the reason he was able to get some good positions and also get to travel a lot across Europe. But and there are many people there, but I don't know which ones to start with. So I'll leave it to you to talk about some of the people he knew, some of those let's say prestigious contacts, and how he even worked in the king's court. Again, that's something I did not know. So I would appreciate if you could talk about the people he knew and how they helped him, rise up the social ladder, and also uh, maybe indirectly helped him with his literary talents and skills as well.
No, absolutely. So yes, as you've already mentioned, he did eventually become a member of the king's household. And even before then, he had fought in France. And when he was taken prisoner, he was ransomed by the king. Now, one thing I do point out in my book is that this is not necessarily an indication that he had a particularly close relationship with Edward III, or even that Edward III really kind of was aware of him as an individual. But nonetheless, it does at least show us the circles in which he is already moving at that point in his career. And of course, really the contact that I think is one of his most important and also most enduring is with John of Gaunt. So this is the Duke of Lancaster, who is he is really one of the most powerful, wealthiest men in 14th century England. And they very likely got acquainted at an early age. They would have been roughly around the same age when they met, so they would have been contemporaries. And so this is an association that he seems to have had really throughout his life. As I'm happy to talk about later, he seems to have written at least one poem to commemorate the death of Gaunt's first wife, Blanche. He also, at the end of his lifetime, ends up taking on a new king in his life, Henry IV, who is the son of John of Gaunt. But then Chaucer also has a rather more intimate connection with John of Gaunt thanks to his wife. So he met his wife while he was working in one of these great households. And so his wife, Philippa, had a sister, Catherine, who eventually became the mistress and then finally the wife of John of Gaunt. And so that means that Chaucer sort of has this oddly roundabout connection, both to this, incredibly powerful man, but even to the man who would eventually become the King of England, his son Henry. And that's something that it's interesting to note. Later biographers and later sort of artists who are depicting his family tree really emphasize, they want to note sort of almost depict Chaucer as a part of the royal kind of family tree, if you like.
And but he wasn't really, let's say, that close or a member of that royal family. But he had that, yeah.
No, but he was in the circles there, and I think it's very likely that even if he didn't necessarily receive direct patronage from, either Edward III or Richard II, or even necessarily Henry IV, these are circles in which poetry would have been shared among small groups. And we do at least see in some of his shorter poems that he does seem to be composing short poems for some of the members of these different circles at different points in his life.
And he has this work again. I did not know about that because I was just obsessed with Canterbury Tales. Book of Duchess. It's one of his earlier works, and I'm sure it's new to a lot of listeners as well. Just very briefly introduce it. Of course, spoiler alert. I want to read it myself, but can you tell us how it also helped him with his literary talents and skills?
Absolutely. So the Book of the Duchess is really among his earliest major literary works. It's what's known as a dream poem. This is a very popular genre in the Middle Ages. So usually it takes the form of a kind of first-person account, either of a dream or a vision of some kind. And it's a poem that he wrote likely sometime around the end of the 1360s or beginning of the 1370s. In response to the death of Blanche, the Duchess of Lancaster. So this is John of Gaunt's first wife. It seems to have been a happy marriage from what very little we know. And certainly John of Gaunt, for years following the death of Blanche, would actually commemorate her death on a regular basis. And so it seems likely that this poem was written not perhaps on the occasion of her actual death, but for one of those later commemorations. And of course, this is a poem that really, I personally can't imagine what it would have been like to write in Chaucer's position. Chaucer is not a member of the nobility. He's not a member of the royal family. I'm not sure you could even describe him really as a courtier at this sort of, early point in his career. And he is endeavoring to write a poem that's intended to console one of the greatest men in England, concerning the loss of his wife. So this is, it's a topic, it's a subject that requires tact, skill, and it's remarkable the extent to which we see that in evidence in this poem. It's a very elegant poem, just in terms of its subject matter. We get these very charming images of the sort of, countryside, of a hunt that's going on in his sort of dream. We get a very charming also opening, which depicts a narrator, which may or may not be sort of a stand-in for Chaucer himself, and who seems to be having trouble sleeping. He seems to have some sort of, sorrow or something that's preoccupying him and that prevents him from actually going to sleep. And so he's reading a book that happens to mention the god Morpheus, who I believe is the god of sleep. And it inspires him to essentially pray to the god to ask him for help in falling asleep. And he promises this god that if he is allowed to go to sleep or help to go to sleep, he will then give the god this incredibly luxurious, bed, essentially, as a kind of tribute. And lo and behold, as soon as he's promised this, he falls asleep and has this dream vision. So it's a really sort of, it's not a terribly long poem, but it is, as I say, one of his first major works. And it's a poem in which we see both his familiarity with French style, with the conventions of the dream poem genre, and also his ability to sort of approach the topic of mourning from a kind of obliquely, let's say. So in the dream, he actually encounters a man in black who appears to be mourning, for having lost his love, although we don't know how. And he, as the kind of dreamer figure, keeps asking the knight to tell him more about why he's so sad. It's not until the very end of the poem when the knight says it's because the love of his life is dead. And it's at this point that the dream sort of begins to dissolve. And in that moment, we can actually see a lot of clues that are hidden in wordplay that suggest that this is indeed about the Duke of Lancaster himself. We're told that Chaucer hears a hunt in the distance that's fading away by a long castle with walls white, by St. John on a rich hill. And so within just a couple of lines, these all seem to be references to Gaunt himself, who is the Duke of Lancaster, so Long Castle. He's mourning his wife Blanche, the French word obviously for white. His first name is John. And he is also the Earl of Richmond, a rich hill. And so this is a wonderfully kind of intricate, but also respectfully distanced way that Chaucer manages to approach the subject of John of Gaunt's mourning in this poem. And it's remarkable to see that in his early work.
It sounds very surreal as well.
Yeah, medieval poetry is great for surrealism. It's just,
yeah. The French surrealism is not that new anyhow.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's another thing. Do you think so? He had a lot of important roles. He was a controller of customs. He obviously worked with numbers and accuracy. Do you think that his skills in with numbers also helped him craft his poetry, or his skills in crafting poetry? And do we see the influence of these events or these occupations in his poetry?
We definitely see sort of elements of his kind of day-to-day work appear as themes in his poetry. So, for example, in The Shipman's Tale, which is one of the tales that's told in the Canterbury Tales, and concerns how a merchant's wife cuckolds her husband, her merchant husband, with the help of a monk whom she persuades to give her money in exchange for sexual favors because she wants to deck herself out in finery, and her husband, the merchant, is refusing to pony up and give her in cash for that. And so at one point in that poem, we see a sort of brief description of the merchant's working life, what it was like to go up into his little room and to make accounts and do his reckonings and sort of, match up numbers from one place to another. And this is, of course, exactly the kind of activity that Chaucer himself likely either participated in his work with customs, or at the very least, oversaw on a regular basis. We also see it come out in slightly more subtle ways. So, for example, at the end of The Shipman's Tale, there's a sort of series of puns on the word tailing, which in Middle English could refer to either the act of tallying, counting up, potentially the act of telling a tale, or also in a more ribald way, it could refer potentially to the act of intercourse, which of course is something we see depicted in The Shipman's Tale very briefly. So we do see a sort of playful way in which that enters his poetry, but there are also some hints at imagery or experiences that might have been drawn from Chaucer's own experiences in other poems. So the House of Fame, for example, which is one of Chaucer's slightly later dream poems, begins with the narrator encountering an eagle in his dreams. And the eagle describes the life that the narrator seems to live. And that seems to involve him coming home after a long day of, his accounting, making up his reckonings. But still, when he's exhausted at the end of his working day, coming home and sitting with a book until his eyes are just bleary and dazed. Which is, it's very tempting to see that kind of detailed imagery as a snapshot from Chaucer's own life. Of course, this is a poem. It's not an actual historical record, but it's so tempting to imagine Chaucer coming home at the end of his working day and, thinking about books, writing poems, because, of course, that is not what his job was in the Middle Ages. He was an administrator. He was a diplomat, a bureaucrat. And then on the side, he just happened to write some masterpieces of Middle English poetry.
Yeah, this is amazing. And you do, at the beginning of your book, you do talk about how sometimes it's difficult to write about Chaucer. You have this section of a chapter called Chaucer versus Chaucer. Yeah, you have the real Chaucer, fictional Chaucer, and the way he represents himself in in poetry. So which complicates the stories. Yeah, but I really enjoyed that section of the book as well. Now, this is a sensitive topic because we always got to be careful not to be anachronistic when we talk about portrait of women in literature. But I'm sure if you read it from a feminist perspective or with a feminist literary theory lens, yes, the portrait of women might be called anti-feminist these days. But I'm interested to know what you think about one of his most famous stories is Wife of Bath, and women feature a lot in Canterbury Tales. I'm not sure about his other works. I'll leave it to you to talk about them. But it would be good if we could talk about that part of his work. And you also mentioned a French romance, the Roman of the Rose, how it influenced him in this regard as well.
Yeah. So when it comes to Chaucer's attitude towards women, it's very, very difficult to pin him down. On the one hand, there are quite a lot of clearly misogynist stereotypes that appear in his work. These are, sad to say, even by the Middle Ages, these are well worn. They are very, very conventional. They are the kinds of things that people on the street would have been familiar with. The idea that women talk too much. Interestingly, the stereotype in the Middle Ages was not that women were necessarily frigid or uninterested in sex, but rather that they were too interested in sex. They were not considered to be intellectual figures, but really bodily kinds of entities. and considered to be dishonest. All these kinds of stereotypes were really, really familiar to Chaucer and his readers at the time that he was writing. And it's true that he draws a lot on those conventions, even in his portrayal of a figure like the wife of Bath, who is very often read as a kind of proto-feminist. She's so wonderfully outspoken. She's had 5 husbands, and she's very willing to tell us about life as a married woman, and to think about sexuality and the pleasure of sex, and to think about how a woman in a vulnerable position in the Middle Ages might make the best of that situation by taking advantage of the support that her husbands could offer. And so there are some ways in which that frankness has led a lot of people to really warm to the wife of Bath, at least among contemporary readers. But of course, for medieval readers, she would have come off quite differently. In her outspokenness, they would have said, oh, yes, this is just exactly the worst side of women. Women are only interested in sex. They just want to talk. They're always lying to their husbands and manipulating people. So it's interesting that the very same qualities that make her so entertaining for us today really would have struck medieval readers in a very different way. Now, you mentioned the French poem, the Roman de la Rose, and this is indeed a poem with which Chaucer was familiar. There are some points in his work where it's even suggested that he translated the poem into Middle English, and although a few fragments of such translations survive, it's unclear whether they can be attributed to Chaucer with a great deal of certainty. But this is a poem that also contains a lot of sort of anti-feminist satire, including a depiction of an older woman known as La Vieille, the old woman, who seems to have been some sort of a model for Chaucer's wife of Bath. She also talks about how young women should basically squeeze their admirers for everything they can get out of them. How they should manipulate and deceive their admirers and their lovers to make the most of the time when they're young and beautiful. So we have this on the one hand. But on the other hand, we do have moments throughout his work where it seems as though Chaucer is noticing and articulating things that are not consistent with an anti-feminist or misogynist perspective. So, for example, one of the more famous remarks that the wife of Bath makes in her prologue, which is much longer than the tale she actually goes on to tell, is that she reflects on the fact that if women were to tell stories or write stories about men, in the same way that men write stories about women, gosh, women could really tell a lot of bad stories about men. So it's a moment when we see a character reflecting on the fact that, it's the sort of tale teller who determines how the tale is told. And it's difficult to know, is this Chaucer actually having a genuine moment of thinking about whether the story might be different if women were writing all the stories instead of men? Or is he just sort of mocking what he might imagine as a kind of typical womanly retort? So there's moments like that, and there are a lot of moments where he apologizes to women, or where he seems to be admitting that, oh yes, he's made mistakes in some of his past poems, and he's made women look bad, and he really didn't mean to. And so one of the difficult things when you're reading Chaucer's writing about women is to try to parse all that and figure out where he stands. And I will say, as someone who's been working with his work for years, it's just about impossible.
And I really like the point you made about his portrait of women and how it's difficult to pin them. And again, it's one of those misconceptions about medieval world in general and the role of women. There were lots and lots of women there. Even their portrayal of sexuality, or the conception of sexuality, was completely was very progressive, something that we can't even fathom these days. And I do remember I read the book some time ago, which was a collection of medieval German erotic stories, something like this, and the active sexual role that women had. Some of them even dressed as men and engaged in intercourse with men. And apparently, not that it was common, but I mean, when you could write about those stories, it just completely changes your mind about the idea of women and also sexuality and their role. Even in folk tales of medieval folk tales, they do have a lot of active role, but it kind of changed, I guess, after we moved to Renaissance.
I blame them.
History. Yeah. Let's. I guess medieval is always got to blame Renaissance scholars. That's right.
They all went downhill after the Renaissance.
Yeah. But I'm glad that by more recent I've been, it's been a few decades now that there's this backlash against portrayal of the Middle Ages as these dark ages. And there are lots of good public accessible books on that as well. I think Bright Ages and Light Ages, there were two famous books a few years ago came out. And books about women, books about Chaucer. Even when your book is not really a debunking of medieval myths, but when you read them, you come to think that, well, this is challenging all those myths that I had about the Middle Ages in my mind. And I guess it's also relevant here now to talk about political satire, social and political satire, and Chaucer's response to sociopolitical events of his life in the 14th century England. And so he was not really a sort of guy that was in his own ivory tower writing poetry. He did react to but that's what you expect perhaps of an artist or a writer. But if it would be great if we could talk about that and also tell us how it's relevant to today's let's say tolerance or intolerance towards controversial topics, because you know that even in the US these days it's been a few years that you're censoring books, novels, and it doesn't matter where you come from, the right or the left, they seem to be canceling each other, and it's not easy to approach certain topics. So a lot of artists even are self-censoring. So can you talk about Chaucer and then tell us what lessons can we learn from him?
Yeah, I mean, Chaucer is interesting when it comes to thinking about him as a poet, because as I mentioned, it wasn't his day job. And on the other hand, you would expect that someone with the kind of day jobs that he had and being in such close contact with these key players in 14th century English political and social history, you kind of expect to see that come through a bit more in his poetry. And the fact is, what's really striking about his poetry and even more specifically his satire is how little it refers to current events in his own time. I mean, if you think about it, he lived through the Peasants' Revolt, and it's unclear whether or not he was in London at the time that it took place, but certainly, he had lodgings over Aldgate, and this is where the rebels were kind of bursting into London and, running riot. So this is one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval English history, and it's only referenced very obliquely in The Nun's Priest Tale, where we have a description of a kind of barnyard chase in progress. Everybody's chasing a fox that's run off with a rooster. And the noise of that chase is compared to the noise of the rebels who burst into London on the 13th of June, 1381, and actually dragged dozens of Flemish residents out of a church where they'd been seeking refuge and beheaded them in the street. And this was all really quite close to where Chaucer's home in London was at the time. And it wasn't long after that, in fact, that he gave up that home and he moved elsewhere. So it's really remarkable that that's kind of the only really specific reference that we have to current events of his time. But on the other hand, one of the suggestions I make in my book is that it might have been precisely because of all the ties that he had to people in very powerful positions that he felt that it was not wise to engage directly with this. So Chaucer is not a poetic figure that I would say, one could argue, was really speaking truth to power on a regular basis. And in fact, when it comes to his satire, he really goes for what you might think of as kind of mainstream and conventional targets for 14th century literature. And of course, the two most popular targets for satire at this point in time are the clergy and the church on the one hand, and women on the other. Now, in fact, he is such a success in terms of his use of anti-clerical or anti-fraternal satire of the church and the clergy that when we get to the 16th century, reformers actually almost think of him as a proto-Protestant. He's so critical of the corruption and sin of the Catholic Church that he almost seems to be ahead of his time in that respect from their perspective. And of course, as I've already mentioned, when it comes to women, he draws on a lot of anti-feminist satire. And this is, you might think of it as really playing to the crowd. This is material that would have appealed to a wide swath of English, audiences at this time. So I suppose that, when we look at his work and we're thinking about that dimension of it in relation to what we see today, again, we're sort of thinking about, well, what are the responsibilities of writers and creators, creative people, when it comes to the controversies and topics of their own time? If we do think of them as people who are charged with a certain responsibility on that behalf, I'm not sure that we can say Chaucer really took that responsibility up in any wholehearted way. But then, as I mentioned on the other hand earlier, there are these little moments where we seem to get glimpses of a certain kind of awareness on his part. There seems to be moments when we see an awareness of the inegalities of his time, some of the injustices of his time. And he may not be addressing it directly, but they do sometimes filter in to his work.
Mm. Talking about taboo topics, let's talk about body humor. You have a chapter on that, yeah? There is a genre, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Fablio. Would be great if you could tell us what that genre is, talk about its origin, and also what do you mean by body humor in medieval, what is body humor in medieval literature, and how it, how Chaucer employs this technique in his writing.
Absolutely. So, yes, this was actually kind of a tricky chapter to write in the sense that Chaucer definitely was not only an author of bawdy humorous material, but it's definitely what he is most known for today. If you think of him as and his style, the themes that interest him. And so I really wanted to make sure that this was a topic that sort of had its own chapter and that we could consider in the context of the rest of his life and work. But Fablio, this is a genre that was popularized in 12th century France. And Fablio are essentially short comic stories that are scurrilous and often scatological or obscene. So these are stories that would feature things like fart jokes, nudity, illicit sex, and also quite a lot of trickery. What also sets them apart is that they tend to be set in the medieval present, so in the present day of the Middle Ages. And instead of featuring, aristocratic or noble characters or mythical characters, they feature characters who are drawn from the lower and middle classes. Now, this was a genre that I say was popularized in France around the 12th century, but it didn't really catch on in England until much later. And in fact, it caught on so late that Chaucer has often been described as the author of the first fablios in English. This isn't true, but it is true that there is only, at least to my knowledge, one known fablio that survives in Middle English that predates Chaucer. And it is also the genre that he experimented with the most in the context of the Canterbury Tales. He revisits it, and he revisits its tropes and its imagery and its jokes, and he does that on a regular basis. But at the same time, I think it's important to point out that, fablio were not the only places where you might see sexual or scatological humor. So, for example, you can still go into certain medieval churches and cathedrals and see carvings that really don't look as though they belong in a church or in a cathedral. Some of the most famous examples are carvings of Sheila na gigs. And so these are carvings of female figures who seem to be bending over and displaying their vulvas, which are often sort of oversized and really kind of, in your face. And so it's really quite common to see these in medieval churches. There are also other kinds of carvings you might find. There's one carving in a church in Gloucestershire that depicts a man with a penis in his mouth. And so it's unclear, precisely what the significance of these carvings were, but they're there. They're there to be found in unusual places. Similarly, and probably more famously, you'll find a lot of comic obscene figures in the margins of medieval manuscripts, even ones that are apparently concerning very devout or educated material. And probably one of the most famous examples is an image that is included in the book. And this is an example, an image where you see a nun picking penises that seem to be growing on what's come to be known as a penis tree. And this is a very famous image that appears in the margins of a manuscript of the Roman de la Rose, in fact, which is currently in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And perhaps most interestingly, at least from my perspective, it's not necessarily the penises in the tree that are the most interesting, but the fact that this is an image that may very well have been drawn by a woman, a female illustrator of the manuscript. So this is all to say that bawdy humor wasn't something that was necessarily confined only to dirty stories in the Middle Ages, or only available to readers or a certain group of readers. It could be found in lots of corners of medieval life. But as I say, it's the genre that he returns to over and over in the Canterbury Tales, and he seems to be interested in using it to explore the idea of limits. Just how far can he take this kind of obscene humor before objections are raised? And most famously, in the prologue to The Miller's Tale, he warns his readers that the tale that's following concerns harlotry or obscenity. And he warns them that if they're just not up for that kind of thing, they should turn over the leaf and choose another tale. So I think this is something he's really interested in. How much can he sort of provoke or challenge readers with this kind of material before they object?
And just as a final question about Chaucer's legacy, he more or less became famous. Didn't take him long to become famous. But in terms of inspiring other poets, what was his legacy and the legacy of his work, especially Canterbury Tales?
That is a great question, and I have to say that the answer depends on which century you're talking about.
I deliberately left it broad because,
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. When we're talking about Chaucer, we're talking about the English author for whom the most evidence exists for his reception, longer than anybody, obviously longer than Shakespeare. He's on the ground well before Shakespeare arrives. And so that means that we have centuries of evidence of how people responded to him and his work. And it really does evolve. What we find in the 15th century is he is almost immediately held up as a key figure in English literary history. He is celebrated as I mentioned, as this kind of father figure, the man who really made English an eloquent and elegant literary language. We see this in Middle English poetry from the 15th century, Middle Scots poetry from the 15th and early 16th centuries. But then that legacy evolves, especially as readers become more and more distant from Chaucer's language, which becomes increasingly inaccessible, even from as early as the late 16th century. But also from, his culture, his time. If you remember that quote that I mentioned pretty much near the start of the podcast from Joseph Addison, in 1694, we're already seeing someone reflecting on the fact that Chaucer's humor really doesn't work anymore in the same way that it might have done during Chaucer's lifetime. And as I also mentioned, now we're living in a time where more people are likely to have heard of Chaucer and to have a sort of general impression of who he was, what he wrote. They'll probably know that he wrote the Canterbury Tales. They're less likely to know about the Book of the Duchess. And if they know anything about his legacy or his style, they're more likely to think of him as a kind of bawdy poet. The two parts of the Canterbury Tales that people are most familiar with tend to be the Miller's Tale on the one hand and the figure of the Wife of Bath on the other. And these are two of the most famously bawdy creations that Chaucer put out into the world.
And before we say goodbye, you mentioned that you're working on another Chaucer book, His Project, which is almost close to completion, hopefully.
Yes, it is. It is. And so, this is a larger book that essentially looks at the last 600 or so years of people reading Chaucer. And it's specifically interested in how people have responded to his bawdy humor over time. And I've been having a lot of fun writing that because just as Chaucer's legacy changes over time, people's responses to his obscene humor also change a great deal over time. And it's funny because they go from, an almost embarrassing aspect of his work, a part of his work that people enjoy, but they don't want to claim that they enjoy, to really kind of the whole reason we read Chaucer in the first place. If you look at the texts that are most likely to be taught in a survey course of Middle English literature, Chaucer's text, you're going to have obviously the Canterbury Tales, and of those tales, it's very likely going to be something like the Miller's Tale or the Wife of Bath's Prologue. There's a journalist in the 1990s who is able to argue that the word Chaucerian can be defined as bawdy in an acceptably old English way. And so really the book that I am currently in the process of completing, it's basically written and revised, but now I want to make it good, is just tracing the sort of 600-year history of Chaucer's reputation as both the father of English poetry, but also a master of dirty medieval humor.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to talk to you about that book very soon on New Books Network again.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, for sure. So, Dr. Mary Flannery, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. I did want to mention to our audience that Reaction Press has this great series of books, Medieval Lives, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Lots of fascinating topics. And I have another one on my desk for a podcast hopefully next month. And the books there, the quality of paper is great. The narrative is wonderful, and there are lots of images in each series as well, including this one. So I do strongly recommend this book to our listeners. Even if you think you know Chaucer, there is still a lot in the book that you can learn from. Mary, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us on New Books Network.
Oh, thank you for having me back, Morteza. I look forward to next time.